have the capacity to remember more things, but crucially doesn't mean that those things constantly flow in your head. So it's the fact that you're able to remember more things is the fact that you have an expanded memory. It's an amplification of your memory. So when you choose to remember things, it just means you have a wider breadth of experiences to draw from. Crucially within this, I'm going to talk to you about why negative emotions are crucially always things that you remember within your limited brain capacity and often offsets positive emotions. But crucially, how this specific thing allows you to access more positive emotions that offset the worst negative parts of your life. Negative emotions. Three things here. One, they are formative. So it's the fact that when a dog barks at you and that elicits an emotional response of fear, it's the fact that your biases buy into that and make you have a fight or flight response. What that crucially means is your body's emotional response is to prioritize the fact that you felt fear and to offset that negative emotion within your experiential calculus, and always puts a positive and more like prioritization of that value in every experience that you have. Two, it's the focusing on the depth of that thing. So when a harm happens to you, you focus on how it may affect other things within your life, not specifically on that specific harm. Like when I lose a job, it's not just that I lost the job, it's all the fact that I lost money, and that money means I can't do other things. It's the focus on depth of harm and the harm itself. But thirdly, it's vivid in so far as that even if you don't remember this emotion, it's your body internalizes it far more, and that means that your body reacts negatively or feels negative emotions that overwhelm you. The impact here at the start is when individuals are able to identify more like those specific negative emotions vividly and can explain it to them, it means when they go to a therapist, it's far significantly easier for them to offset negative emotions and to talk about them. I think this third mech is especially important there. For positive emotions, how does this play out? And why is this crucially important? Because these aren't as formative. You don't have an emotional response of happiness. You feel like dopamine shock when you eat an ice cream, or maybe you get a like on Instagram, and that makes you feel to some extent happy and things. Two, it's no fight or flight response, because often those things are not specifically like they don't replicate themselves insofar as that fear necessarily plays out. Crucially, what that means on op is your limited brain capacity, insofar as your brain can only remember a certain amount of neurons and functions, always prioritize negative emotions because that body believes that it is the prioritization of life in and of itself. Versus when you have an expanded brain, that brain can posit and intake all of those positive emotions far better. What are the impacts of this? One, you have more positive, vivid emotions that access within your calculus. That crucially means when OO talk about negative emotions, that is significantly easier to access this. That's a symmetric harm. The positive benefit is you are likely to feel happy. Two, it notes every experience that you endure. So this is crucially important, right? Because the impact here cannot be understated. It is every experience that you face, whether it's eating an ice cream, you can remember that with happiness. It's the fact that instead of you alternatively just focusing on those negative emotions, especially when you're in times of despair, I think is bad. But look, this is contextualized, right? I think it's the fact that you can contextualize those positive emotions more and offset them against the fact that you have negative emotions. It just means you as an individual are likely to be happier or not to have negative experiences as much. Weighing in this one, why do we beat opening government? Opening government said that utility is not a good in and of itself and does not happen in a vacuum, but neither there's choice. And that is something that they never proved is important, right? Because choice may necessarily guarantee utility, but the thing that you ought to prioritize when adjudicating this debate is better choices that are made. Insofar as if you had three choices and the fourth choice result like three choices, each one you died in, but the fourth choice also meant you died. That isn't an objective good or an objective subjective good. It's the fact that if you had less choices, but those choices meant that you'd like healthcare or things that just made your life better, then those things ought to be prioritized, which is what we're talking about. But two, it's more proximate in the fact that we talk about your emotions that affect your daily life and every type of experience that you have, because OG's case is premised on you accessing things like jobs and wealth and getting to university. But I'm unsure why externalities like race, accents, your social standing don't affect that, and why it's just this one tipping point that needed to be proven. And I think OG's analysis is significantly marginalized within that. Thirdly, social mobility. The context here is that you've life experiences, whether not social mobility, sorry, relationships. Look, you are able to maintain relationships far better. What is the problem status quo? You're incredibly busy. You work 40 hours a week. Maybe you go to university as well and you have to study. Maybe it's the fact that maybe you have to work menial like labor and it means you work. You also have to sleep 8 hours a day in order to be a healthy, functioning person. That means you have to balance off friends. So even if you have like 10 friends or as many friends that are in this call, right, it means you can't actually remember much things about them. So every time you have a hello or a conversation with them, it is incredibly superficial because your memory has a limited capacity to engage with that. And it just means that often you forget things about those friends. Maybe you forget to respond. And if anyone's ever texted me on Messenger, they will know I'm terrible at it, right? It's just your inability to actually engage with that and makes sure all of those relationships significantly worse. But two, it's familial relationships. It's the fact that your parents may have like slapped you as a child. That was something that was, you don't actually contextualize that. You just have that negative emotion and affects your ability to access your parents. But the reason that that is crucially important is, at least on our side, you can contextualize it. The impacts here are the following. One, mental health issues are necessarily better because of the fact that when you have a friendship, the reason you talk about these issues is based on the proximity and trust. The more you talk about those experiences and can remember, people are likely to trust you and you can trust them. Two, relationships necessarily allow every experience you have to be better. I don't enjoy watching a movie alone in my room more so than I just enjoy watching it like a TV show with Hugh in his house, right? It's significantly better because you can talk about those experiences and experience them more and gain more utility from them. And overall, those things get better. Quickly, on context of what this looks like, I'm not going to take a few why. You can do that. Why is this important? Because look, I think in OG's case, and this fills it in, I think that you are often born in a developing nation. One, because individuals often don't have access to things like contraception because it tends to be expensive for governments to provide. Things like access to things like education on safe sex. B, it's just a lack of choices, right? Like if you're in developing nations and they haven't built up services, like sex is just a good way to get dopamine and to enjoy your life, right? So the thing here is you're probably given birth rate trends in the developing nation is that these individuals have more children. It is crucially important not that you access university, but crucially you get skills like being able to fish better. Maybe it's a carpentry that you can vividly remember, and that crucially means that you can access more capital quickly and accrue it as an individual to offset the systematic discrimination that happens to you as an individual. But crucially, what that means over periods of time is that that capital means that you can save your family member from getting ill. You can buy basic things like food. You can buy things that offer you security and mean that you as an individual have more utility, less negative utility, but also just as a whole, it just means that less people around you are starving. More people can then access the things that OG want to talk about, like jobs or education, through things like scholarship. But firstly, you need the capital to be able to even access basic things like education. For all of those reasons, closing government.
We thank the member for the government and are happy to call upon the member for the opposition. Hear, hear.
For POIs, please use the chat. We think that how this debate plays out strategically is that Gov says that there are a variety of positive things that you can think about that will make you really happy. And then Ob says, there's a lot of negative things that are really triggering. And then it becomes quite messy to judge about whether we should care about these negative or these positive memories more. What we're going to do is break this deadlock and extension by explaining why it's substantially more likely that we're going to fixate on negative memories. And why even if we have positive memories, we're going to be a lot more likely to draw negative conclusions from those in a way that is going to fundamentally cripple our identities. I'm going to start out with some framing about what matters in this round and then get into our extension. Clash will be integrated. In terms of framing, what I want to chat about here is which priority actually matters. So a lot of things are being thrown around between money, relationships, choice. We see that a sense of identity that is lost when negative memories cripple you is the most important, and I'm going to go through why. So firstly, when it comes to CG's claim about relationships, I think that the problem is there is an asymmetry where you have this condition where you remember everything else about other people, but they don't remember those same things about you. This A leads you to feel resentful because you're always a step up in your relationship where you remember substantially more about them than they do about you. But secondly, it's not an expectation within society that you literally remember every finite detail because you do not live in a world where everyone has these conditions. Also, as an intuition pump, people have fulfilling relationships without this condition. It's clearly not necessary for self-actualization. On money, let's say that somehow part of this motion is like you perfectly remember all of your multiplication tables, that I think is quite ridiculous. But why do you think that money is not the most important frame in this debate? Number one, I think that our expectations adjust over time as we continually accumulate more capital. So even if you get really rich and you buy a fancy belt, what this means is that eventually the belt seems a lot less special to you and you just want more things in the future. Secondly, you judge your financial success relative to other people. So you don't get self-actualization through getting stuff when you often are in higher corporate circles where other people also have that kind of stuff. So it devalues it on an individual level. But finally, as an empirical intuition pump, think about how many famous and successful people are miserably unhappy. Like suicide rates tend to be incredibly high high amongst white men who are CEOs in like high profile positions. I just don't think it's true that money necessarily leads to happiness. The other frame that OG tries to say is, there's some kind of inherent value of choice. A couple things to say here. Number one, we reject the fact that choice is an inherent moral good absent of utility. The reason that OG cares about choice is that we're able to make decisions that are more aligned with what our best interests actually are. But it's not that those interests are good. It's that we're able to get things from making choices that are in our own interest. But we would say that if the product of those choices is a negative outcome, that ultimately falls into a principle of utility. But secondly, this is where the frame of our extension comes in. Negative memories are something that are going to cripple choice and to cripple your identity. Remembering a greater quantity of things does not correlate into an increased quantity of choice if the things that you remember distort your ability to make rational decisions. We would posit that fixating on negative memories creates incredibly negative and irrational thought processes. So it's about a feeling of heartbreak that you continually fixate on, and then you think that you're never going to be enough for anyone again. It's thinking about the time that you recalled that a loved one passed away, the dread that you felt, and feeling that you're never going to be complete. It's like you decided not to go to law school because you were too stressed and you always dreamed of becoming a lawyer, and then you experience crippling regret. This does not create more choice, but it creates a situation that is emotionally crippling, where you fixate on these memories that can throw you into self-deprecating and depressive cycles, where you feel less inclined to make free choices in the future because you feel a lot of fear about what those choices are able to be. How then does this fold into our extension? How are we going to improve our frame about identity? I want to talk about multiple things here. The first thing to say is that we are disproportionately likely to fixate on negative memories. CG tries to say something to like preempt this, which is basically that when our brains can only remember so much, it's going to be negative stuff. We say why. If our brains can only remember a finite quantity of information, it actually appears to be a far more rational defense mechanism to fixate on things that are comparatively more positive, because that brings you a greater quantity of joy. What are the mechanisms under our side of the house? Number one, other people within your life are more likely to discuss and focus on positive shared experiences because they enjoy those things with you, and it brings you a sense of happiness. So what this means is that the emotional urgency of replaying positive experiences is a lot lower when you literally already have a mechanism to connect and to dwell on that on a day-to-day basis. And it actually becomes quite alienating to think back on positive kinds of memories because other people are unable to recall those kind of memories in the same quantity of detail as you. So you cannot reappreciate those experiences in the way that you were able to do so initially. So I think that given that we already have a vehicle to access that, our brain often focuses on things that are more absent. Secondly, though, negative emotions tend to compound over time in a way that positive emotions don't. This is because negative emotions are reflective rather than sensory experiences. So regret is often something that you're able to think, what could I have done? And there are a million possibilities. When there's an emotion like grief, you continually dwell back on the experiences that you had with a person that ultimately passed away. This is different from positive emotions like the joy of getting married. They're often a lot more sensory rather than dwelling on possibilities, which means you end up thinking about sensory emotions substantially more. The final thing is that due to evolutionary processes, we often disproportionately focus on negative things. The reason for this is that when we were being created as species, the way that we primarily improved ourselves as a species and prioritized our own existence was continually focusing on negative things, such that we had a drive to improve our own quality of life. And I think that thus is often an evolutionary reason that we often think about negative emotions. Secondly, even if we dwell on positive memories, this is likely to elicit emotions that are overwhelmingly negative. The reason for this is that when we're going to think back on positive memories, we don't just do that arbitrarily. We often have something in our life that causes us to rethink back on those positive memories. So we might be in a relationship that will then cause us to think back to a memory about another relationship, right? So if you're refalling in love, you might then think about your first love. So this is bad because if the initial experience was better than what you're currently experiencing, this can often create a dreadful kind of longing, right? Because the initial set of experiences that you had was substantially better than the kind of experiences that you are presently able to access. But secondly, if the original experiences were negative, then this just brings back a feeling of crippling insecurity because you know that things were once bad, and then that creates a level of fear. So I don't think this is actually a good thing. The final claim I want to advance under identity is that an individual's sense of self is substantially better. So it is very important that individuals have a notion of the separateness of self, where we're able to move on from the kind of person that we once were. We think that identity is something that is transient, and we often don't perceive personhood as being something that is fixed, but something that is fluid. So I think I right now am a different person to whom I was 5 years ago because I've had people who have shaped me. I've had memories who have shaped me. I've had trauma who has shaped me. However, when you're able to continually have memories, this stops this process because you're continually haunted by the ghost of your former self. You no longer have separateness of your lived experiences, where you always think back about the kind of person that you once were, and there's always a feeling of being tied to your former identity because you're unable to escape it. A feeling of moving forward forward from a past identity is something that is very important, because the reason why we often self-select into perceiving our own self-image as being something that is different is that we dislike something from our former self. So our former self is associated with a kind of trauma. It's associated with a personality that we no longer believe is the best personality for you. And therefore, in order to feel confident, in order to feel good about yourself, you end up reshifting into a different paradigm of your own self-image. So we think that this is the most important thing, because it's literally about the way that you constitute your very identity. And if you want choice in this debate, it's best that you do not subject people to emotionally crippling memories. For all these reasons, I'm very proud to stand in closing opposition.
We thank the member for the opposition and are happy to call upon the government whip. Hear, hear.
Cool. Mic check. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Thank you. Very simple whip. First of all, why we beat CG, then why we beat our opening, then why we beat CO, then why we beat OO. 3 things we do to extend off our opening. First of all, Jack tells you at the end of his speech that often your amount of success, your amount of money does not exist in the vacuum. It exists insofar as you have other things, like the fact that your ability to critically analyze. So this means that all of OO's analysis about when you were in college, it is important to go to a good law school. You want to go to Duke, you don't want to go to McGill, for example. But what I think what this means is that it means that Jack's analysis about how you get fundamental skills and how you get starting capital is more important, because we tell you the mechanism as to how you can actually access choice, which is not your ability to be in law school, because we're not sure why it is better to be in Duke versus McGill, or, an example which is less funny. We think it is probably more important to actually be able to access choice in that first place. So your ability to have some capital, to learn some skills. We also note that we weigh this by saying like 90% of births that are happening right now, given that this has would-be born motion, are happening in the developing world, where you likely do not have access to the sort of things that OG state as a prerequisite, like being in advanced college or having access to things like a law degree or medical degree. Second of all, we think in terms of weighing, they say the utility does not exist in a vacuum, therefore we should default to choice. We tell you that choice does not exist in a vacuum. We tell you specifically that even if we provide less choices, the fact that our choices are, first of all, more concrete, and second of all, they are like more better and more utilitarian, better utility. We think it is beneficial at the point at which that we guarantee that your perception of your life will be better because you can now experience positive emotions to a greater extent. We think this means that you can just, even if we have less choices, the choice we have guarantee utility, rather than what we think has been like quite fairly responded to by OO and CO, that maybe you go to law school, that probably just makes you kill yourself. I'm in law school right now. I can agree with that. Third thing to note is the fact that we tell you your relationships are better off. We think like part of the human experience which guarantees you good things isn't how much money you have or what job you have. It is having beneficial relationships. No man is an island. We all live in a society, unfortunately. We think relationships are quite important, and they are definitively and concretely and certainly important, rather than OG, which are not definitive. Next, why we beat CO. CO tend to rest on quite a non-comparative basis. Like, I'm going to go through line by line their 6 mechanisms and tell you why we take them out. But I think also notice that Jack preempted their entire case, because he tells you how the mind works. It is not what CG responds to you or CO respond to us when they say, well, I mean, you're going to remember positive things anyway, because that just makes more sense for a human to do. We tell you that the human mind is not a rational actor. What the human mind does is it does what it has evolved to do over millions of years. We evolved from like monkeys and apes, but also just like cavemen and Neanderthals. What those individuals did was they only survived if they had a very strong fight or flight response. The thing that made the biggest impact to them in their mind, in their neurons, in what they remembered, were things that were incredibly negative to you. So therefore, we say on opening opposition or on-side opposition, if you have a normal mind, you live through life remembering your negative experiences, but not remembering your positive experience. So therefore, when they say, oh, well, this is just a way up about like if you have more negative or positive, we tell you on their side, you have all the same experience of your negative emotions, but you never have the experience of your positive emotions. Second of all, if the way up is like if you have more negative or positive experience in life, we ask you then why do like 99% of people not choose to opt out of life and kill themselves? We think that is just the fact that people do experience their life as net positive. Even materially, if you weigh it up by the utility calculator machine, which by the way doesn't exist, we think maybe you can prove that life is net negative. Your perception of life, which is your only ability to understand utility, still means that you choose to opt into life. So we think you should probably weigh positive experience better. Engaging with the mechanisms from closing opposition, just to take them out more conclusively. I'll take you later. First of all, they say you fixate on negative things. We tell you, first of all, in Jack's speech, he tells you that it is easier to resolve. So this means when you go through trauma when you were 16 years old, on our side, on both sides, you can fixate on that thing because that thing stays with you because it was hugely formative to you. But on our side, when you can remember the good things that happened afterwards, you remember your friends supporting you more. You remember the fact that things weren't so bad because rather than defining your entire 16th year by that trauma, you can remember more things like the beneficial things that happened to you. So it means it is easier to resolve in the heart and you don't repress that bad stuff as much. So it means if you do have negative emotions, you can deal with them better over time. Second of all, they say that negative emotions compound over time. We say yes, that is why it exists more on your side of the house, because when it compounds over time, it sticks with you. Third of all, they say good experience are largely sensory. We tell you that because they are sensory, once you stop sensing that things and understand those things, these things are fleeting. So on their side of the house, you lose that positive experience, but you keep the negative experience. So on their side of the house, you only have negative experience. Fourth of all, they gave something about evolution and your drive to be negative. We tell you like evolution, I already responded to that. Evolution means you only remember negative. Fifth of all, they say that if you have you always compare what is now to what was. So this means that if you have a relationship, you're going to compare it to your past relationship. First of all, we think there's no weighing as to whether your life now or your life in the past will be better. So we think this could easily flip. They give no reason why it's worse on their side of the house. Second of all, we think they often you think you often have a present bias in the sense that often even if you don't remember every detail, you can still compare your past relationships. So they give no reason why this is comparative. Sixth of all, they say it's good to have a sense of self. You get a better sense of self when you know you are different from the past because you can remember the past better. We see on their side of the house, when you don't fully understand why you were different from past you, that's when you have a worse sense of self. That is every single link out of closing opposition gone. It is also OG weighed out. Before I take out OO, would they like to give me a point? I can't hear you. Go on.
Given that the revealed preferences for the vast majority of individuals is to drink and smoke weed and destroy their memories, doesn't that show that we don't like memory that much as humans?
No, because 90% of people aren't potheads who destroy their heads. Factual. Opening opposition, what did they tell you? They tell you that you're always going to focus on certain things. Panel, we tell you that is not how memory works. Status quo, I still have millions of memories, but when I do a test, I do not fixate on all those memories. We're not sure what is comparative between me remembering all 21 years of my life versus me remembering just 2 years of experience. We think at the point at which if you have this condition, this means that you probably are able to remember more things, but a higher quantity of things does not change the fact that your memory doesn't change in terms of how it works. If you look at how the motion is phrased, it does not say your memory works differently. It just says you are able to remember an abnormally large amount of things. So this is why when someone asks me what was my experience like at EUDC this year, I say, oh God, yeah, I remember it was terrible. I needed a win to break in the last round, but Tom Manor only gave me a second. That was really bad. But then you know what I do? I just forget it and move on. We think probably it exists the same way because they never mechanize how your brain actually works differently. So they say this specifically, you just are always trapped within this mind of not understanding anything. We tell you that is entirely untrue. What else do we get? We got no response from CO besides the fact that evolution doesn't work that way, which I've already dealt with. Then they say that often you have an imbalance in relationships. If you have an imbalance in relationships because you're more caring and more remembering, that just means your friends want to be more friends with you because they think that they're worse friends. Everything stands for those reasons, CG.
We thank the government whip and are happy to call upon the opposition whip. Hear, hear.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Excellent. All right, just 1 second. Sorry, I have a bunch of paper. I'm going to start with a discussion of whether choice is the universal end that OG thinks it is. Then I'm going to discuss how we remember things, and then finally on why identity was the most important material in the round. So first, is choice a universal end? OG asserts that choice is a universal end, that it's the only way we can achieve any other ends in life, and therefore we should care about it more than any other. But I just don't think that that is true in a human valuation. For example, let's say that you can live in a world of complete choice, but constant sadness from being able to take that choice, or live in a world of relative happiness where you're generally pretty happy for most of your life. I'd say that most people would take the world where you're relatively happy, but you have less choice, where you aren't constrained to sadness to existential dread for the entirety of your life. But this is just clear for humans as well. We often opt out of choices in the status quo. For example, we often get addicted to drugs and opt into that because we view the perceptual benefit of getting addicted to drugs as more valuable than the choices that could be lost afterwards. Choice is not a universal benefit. We also have to look to the identity that we lose and the sadness that that choice might be able to create. So we don't think that just because you can choose more memories or choose more things or outcomes that could happen, that necessarily means it's a better world from OG. But then they say that OG, the way that you can get more choice is by having more time and more money. Naomi already pointed out how more money and more time doesn't necessarily equate to happiness. People are deeply different. And OG even admits that when they say, look, there are multiplicities of ways people can value their own lives. Look, valuing of money is one of those ways you can value your life. And just asserting that people value money does not get to the end of people having a better life because of that money. Naomi explained how often people are deeply sad when they're only going for instrumental goods rather than deep intrinsic self-validation that we talked about on our side of the house. But let's just engage with Siege's material here. If you are born into a deeply poor community in the developing world, no amount of having structural ability to remember specific facts is going to get you out of that structural situation where you literally don't have access to any education institutions. In the same way, if you are born in a relatively well-off area, if you have the drive that is necessary for both, as I pointed out in a POI to OG, then you are still going to be able to succeed to a relative degree where choices are relatively going to be afforded to you on either side of the house. What this means is that in either context for government, you're going to be unable to get any marginal change in the amount of choices that you're going to have. So even if you do ultimately care about choice, we still get better choice. But ultimately, choice is also contingent on your ability to forego negative emotions, to be able to live on yourself without any existential dread. This is where we get to Siege's extension. They say that we remember negative emotions more in the status quo when memories are capped, whereas on their side of the house, you can get basically more memories, and so necessarily you're going to get more good memories. But this is not how humans remember things. It's not the case that we don't have good memories. It's the case that in instances of existential dread or anxiety, we don't turn to those good memories. We instead turn to the bad parts about our life. As an intuition pump, even someone who is in a deep existential crisis can often technically think about the good parts of your life. They can often technically conceptualize the good qualities or the good things that you might have done, but they can't understand how those weigh up against the terrible parts, because as Naomi pointed out, you have structural reasons to care more about the bad parts. That doesn't mean you remember the bad parts more. That means you overvalue the memories of those bad parts in the first instance. It's the fact that you already had those bad memories and there are already people who support your good memories. It's the fact that they compound over time. CG agrees with all of the analysis about why we value bad memories. They just misidentify the purpose of when those memories accrue. It's not the case that you don't have good memories. It's the case that you can't look to those good memories in the first place. And that's why Naomi told you that you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't remember something. For example, if you get into a relationship, you're constantly comparing it against your past relationship. This is where we weigh up against OO, where they only analyze emotions like, for example, regret, but we analyze all the spectrum of different emotionality. We give you much more mechanistic analysis about how, because of, for example, things like evolution, you're much more likely to care about the bad emotions that you want to improve yourself, whereas realistically, that's just making you much more sad overall in life. So on their side, you're much less likely to get out of those existential crises. You're much less likely to reach your own and solve your own personal problems on their side. But they say, but guys, come on, you still opt into life. And so clearly your life can't be that bad. But obviously it's the case that your life can be better. Like, sure, we mostly opt into life, but that doesn't mean our lives are necessarily good or the best that they could be. So even if on their side, everyone still opts into life, that doesn't mean people aren't living miserable lives. Many people live miserable lives and don't opt for suicide. The point here is that we remember those negative emotions to the same degree as positive ones, but on their side, they inundate people with those negative emotions on a daily basis. So when you're in that emotional or existential crisis, you draw on a deluge of many more emotional and terrible emotions. You're much less likely to value your own self when you perceive yourself to be connected to your previous self. I'm going to talk about identity, but I'd first like to take a POI from OG.
Your justification for why choice isn't important is that people would choose one hypothetical over the other. If you don't see what's wrong with that, if you actually want to defend why choice isn't important, you should tell me why we should prefer one situation over the other without reference to the preferences of an individual.
Obviously, my point is not that choice never matters. It's that choice is an instrumental good to getting other goods. Like, geez, okay, identity. I'm going to explain why that is the most important instrumental good. Identity has always and will always be transient, right? We always become a different person throughout our lives, and we often don't like the person who we once were. So we often don't have to remember or don't want to remember that person who we once were. Now, CG says it's valuable to be able to conceptualize who that person once was. So you're able to say, aha, I'm definitely different from that person who once existed. But this is incredibly difficult for a human person to conceptualize. It's incredibly difficult to say that that person who literally is me, who literally shares my own flesh and blood, when you remember that person, it's it's incredibly difficult to get over the similarities between you and that person, because generally you are a fairly similar person. It's just that you might share different beliefs. You might be, for example, less racist than you were when you were like a 12-year-old. The point here is that you can't detach yourself from that person who once existed on their side of the house, where when you try to, you are constantly reminded of what that person might have done, of the trauma that person might have caused to an individual, or who that person might have been. You're unable to detach yourself from the identity that once existed. You're unable to formulate your identity, and you're haunted by the ghost of your former self on their side of the house. I want to weigh this argument. Let's say that you could be plugged into a machine where you could simulate all experiences of all possible humans, and let's say you can have perfect choice. Most people would find that inherently disgusting, because even though free will is not inherently true, the identity of an individual is valuable. It's not about what you do, it's about who you are and like the context of who the person that is doing those actions is. We care deeply about being able to shape ourselves, both to others and for our own intrinsic human dignity and the value that we have to that. I want to point out that that illustration shows why we can outweigh a lot of the other claims in this debate with our claim on identity, because identity is the one value that all humans can value. It is a foundation for what we value as choice, for example. So if you believe that you do care about, for example, investment banking, then you might care about the money that OG talks about. But if you cannot formulate your own identity of who you once were and who you are now, then you'll be unable to really understand if that choice is right for you. And therefore, even if they have utilitarian outcomes, they don't understand deeply on a personal level who you are as an individual. We're very proud to oppose.
We thank the opposition.